We all have challenges in life: sadness, broken relationships, anger, bullying, grief, and isolation. But there is hope. Together, we can learn how to bring back joy, re engage with life, restore relationships, and to be alone without being lonely. Welcome to Psychology Talks.
And so speaking about support people, let's talk a little bit about the people surrounding the person who may have suicidal thoughts and how they are a support to that person.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are some do's and don'ts about how to talk to somebody if you believe that they may be suicidal. We know based on research that talking about suicide, mentioning suicide, doesn't necessarily make someone more suicidal. So you don't have to worry that you're going to somehow plant an idea in somebody's head that was not already pre-existing. So that's something important to keep in mind. But there are good ways to talk about suicide with someone and not so great ways to talk about suicide. So often if we're talking with somebody that we love and we fear maybe suicidal, our response is to often act out of that fear in ways that are not particularly helpful. So we may attempt to kind of control that person by saying something like, but consider what this would do to your family if you were to die. And we try to guilt them into not being suicidal. Or we may say something like, but you have so much to live for. Look at X, Y, and Z. And we think that we're being encouraging, but what we're really doing is not listening to that person and respecting their experiences. So it may seem counterintuitive, but when you find yourself talking with a friend or a loved one and you suspect that they may be suicidal, the first thing you should do is really check yourself and recognize that you can't control another person. You're powerless over them. And while that might initially seem a bizarre perspective to take when we're talking about suicide prevention, what that does is allow you to make space for that person to talk about their experiences without interjecting, without trying to give unsolicited advice, and instead really hold space for them and listen to them. And that's really important in those moments. They're always to provide really tangible support and help for folks who are really struggling. So one thing is just as simple as offering to cook them a meal, to watch their kids, to clean their kitchen, inviting them just to go on a walk, do something like that. Provide even some distraction for them in that moment. Those all can be really helpful things to do. And as I mentioned before, some folks are suicidal because it's directly related to a life circumstance, like losing a job. And if it's appropriate, if it feels like it's not crossing a boundary, even offering financial assistance or putting your friend in contact with social services for rent utility assistance, those can all be really helpful, meaningful things that you can do to support that friend who's in crisis.
Okay. So part of listening is understanding what's underlying it. I guess first, don't freak out. If someone says, hey, I'm struggling with these thoughts. So just remain calm and talk with them and try to find out why. So listening to the why and what they're saying, and then offering practical solutions for helping them, it sounds like. So like you said, what can I do to help? And maybe it's as simple as just asking.
Yes, absolutely. And it's okay if you don't always know what to say or what to do. You can still utilize like the crisis text line 741-741. I'm talking to someone, or I have a friend who I think is suicidal. What do I do? So there are still sources of support for you if you're at a loss of what to say or what to do.
Okay. So even if you don't have the answer, you're not able to help them in that moment to figure out what to do. As soon as you get off the phone with them, or as soon as, they leave or whatever, you can call the suicide hotline yourself and talk with them about what steps you take next.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And even recommending to your friend, hey, there's this thing called a RAP plan that you can download. And if you want to involve me in that, I'd be happy to. And then respecting their wishes when it comes to the RAP plan. So the big thing is not crossing boundaries and having those open lines of communication and talking to your friend or your loved one about what they need and what's going to work best for them.
Yeah. Are there other do's and don'ts that you would recommend?
Yeah, I think another thing is to be aware of different types of resources that may be available or that are available. So there are resources specific to particular populations. So for instance, if your loved one is a young adult who is LGBTQ, the Trevor Project has a lifeline, a chat, and text options for folks between the ages of 13 to 24 who identify as LGBTQ. And that's a really great resource to be aware of. Trans Lifeline is another resource out there for folks who are trans or gender nonconforming. And so they can call and talk to a peer who's also trans identified. And Trans Lifeline does not engage in non-consensual active rescue. So that's also another resource to be aware of, depending on who your friend is, and trying to find sources of support that are most relevant to them. So that's a big do.
Right. And so you already mentioned veterans, and I know there are also lines for people that are struggling with substance abuse issues.
Sure. Yes, absolutely. There are a lot of resources out there, which is fantastic.
Okay. And so how does someone go about finding that a resource that's specific to maybe their generation or other issues that might be contributing to what's going on for them?
Yeah, absolutely. So the American Association of Suicidology, you can visit that website, and there are a lot of resources for folks who are dealing with suicide from all sorts of different angles, whether they're in crisis themselves, or if they have a friend or family member who's suicidal, or if they've lost someone to suicide. That's a fantastic place to start and get lots of resources for you, depending on what your population is, what your demographics are. You can find resources that may be best suited for you.
Okay. And then are there other ways that you can give hints to people about how they can talk to someone who might be struggling with this kind of issue?
Yeah, I think the best thing is to, as I mentioned before, to really practice empathetic listening. It's a lot less about what you say and a lot more about how you actually create a space where someone feels safe to talk about what they're going through. That's really key. You don't have to say the perfect thing. There are no magic words to prevent suicide. Instead, just providing a source of support for someone where they know that they can talk to you, you're going to listen to them, you're not going to judge them, is really, really helpful. Especially if you're able to provide some tangible sources of support, that's a really great way to be of assistance to your friend or loved one.
Yeah, and you mentioned tangible sources of support, as it might sometimes be financial, depending on kind of the relationship, the boundaries that need to be established with that person. But what might be some other tangible things, like you mentioned, maybe babysitting or finding ways that you can be a source of stress relief for that person. So maybe it depends on their hobbies or what you know about them. So maybe it's taking them fishing or going shopping with them or whatever it is, right?
Absolutely. Just getting a coffee. It can even be as simple and silly as just sending them cat memes or something, if you know that's a source of just distraction and helps them kind of get out of that space. There are innumerable ways to do that. Speaking a little bit more broadly in a more macro perspective, it's important, I think, when we talk about suicide prevention, and again, not talking about necessarily an individual in an individual moment, but it's important that if folks are concerned about suicide prevention, that they're also concerned about things like social justice, because that plays into a lot of what we know are potential risk factors for suicide. So for things like income inequality, discrimination, to make sure that you're advocating for a society that's going to make it a lot easier for people to want to stick around. Because unfortunately, some folks experiencing suicide do because they live in a society where they're told they don't really belong or they don't have worth and value. So there are other things that we can do tangibly just as citizens to ensure that we're creating an environment in a society that works for everybody and makes everybody feel like they belong and they should stick around.
Yeah, and one thing that we haven't mentioned is the role that faith beliefs might play for someone who is considering suicide, or someone who's wanting to support someone who's considering suicide or has suicidal thoughts. So can we talk a little bit, I know we don't have very much time left, but if we could just talk just briefly about the role of faith.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting question that has, I think, a very nuanced answer to it. So there are a lot of studies that suggest that faith and religion serves as a protective factor for a lot of folks when it comes to suicide and suicidal outcomes. So that's really encouraging. But the flip side of that is that if you are in a faith tradition that teaches that suicide is a sin, or even more devastating, that if you die by suicide, you might not go to heaven, that can be incredibly distressing for somebody who is suicidal or who has lost someone to suicide, and reconciling their faith, what their faith teaches, with this outcome. And I think finding folks that you can talk to within your faith tradition who can really validate you is really important, because unfortunately what those teachings sometimes do is cause someone to feel like they can't talk to anybody about what they're experiencing for fear of judgment, that somebody's going to tell them, well, this is a sin, or your loved one isn't in heaven because they died by suicide. And that's devastating. Nobody wants to hear that. Nobody should hear that. So again, finding resources, faith-based resources that validate the fact that suicide is not a sin, that it's something that people just struggle with like any other thing, is really important. And within most denominations, you can find pastors, you can find literature that validates that belief. So it's important for folks to know that just because that there are a couple people who say one thing in their faith tradition, there are probably some folks that they can find that validate the alternative position.
Right. Yeah. And so it's good to know and have connections with a multitude of people. And that's very biblical. The scripture says to let my people not forsake the gathering together, or not to forsake the gathering together of my people. So, having a multitude of resources within your faith community, and knowing who you might be able to go to. Or if you don't know who you might go to, maybe there's someone else that can point you in the right direction. All right. Well, thank you so much. This has been really informative, and I think hopefully very useful to people out there that are struggling with thoughts of harming themselves. And please know that you are not alone, and that there is help out there, that there are people that you can talk to right now today, 24/7, and that they are always there, that you can reach out to and get the help that you need.
Absolutely. Thank you.